In October of 1944, with the Allies pushing east towards Berlin, Germany launches an assault in the Ardennes forest. During the Battle of the Bulge, Nazi forces attempt to push American, British, and Canadian troops off the continent of Europe. On the other side of the world, Japan launches its own counteroffensive in the Pacific. Theirs is unlike anything America has seen before. Japanese aircraft head straight towards U.S. destroyers, battleships, and aircraft carriers, flown by men prepared to sacrifice their own lives. It is known as Kamikaze, where pilots turn their planes into missiles. Suicide missions intended to cripple the American war machine as they inch closer towards the heart of Japan. These pilots follow the rule of divine wind. Loyal to the Emperor and their homeland, they are willing to die for both. Their weapons are their bodies. Their targets are American ships, pilots, and sailors. This is a story from two different perspectives, from the men willing to die for their country, and from the men determined to stop them. By 1944, the Empire of Japan is in a state of retreat. The area in which they hoped to create a Greater Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere is now a distant memory. The spirit of late 1941, when the land of the rising sun seemed invincible, has vanished. Since America's victory at Midway, the United States takes back island after island from Hirohito's forces. Japanese fighter aircraft are outnumbered by more modern American planes, being produced from the factories in droves. Experienced Japanese pilots are in short supply. In addition, the proximity fuse is utilized, making it almost impossible for Japanese bombers to get anywhere near U.S. naval vessels. No longer do they control the Pacific with an iron fist. By January of 1944, even those in the top circles of Japanese power have concluded that the war is lost. For a nation dependent on imports, they are denied the raw materials desperately needed to continue the war. Japanese merchant ships carrying oil, coal, and other goods are either attacked from the sky or torpedoed by American submarines. Production in Japan is slashed to shreds. To make matters worse, a naval blockade is causing severe shortages in food and materials, resulting in mass starvation. On paper, the war is all but won by the United States.
Really, by the fall of 1944, it's clear from Hirohito's recent biographers who've really studied the Japanese documents, by the fall of 44, he knew Japan had lost the war. But surrender was not on the table because of this notion of honor, and he was also really obsessed with protecting the sort of royal regalia, the symbols of the emperor's authority. And, you know, all through the summer of 45, the Japanese press was running what Hirohito's biographer Herbert Bix called the Die for the Emperor campaign. I mean, this was the message to the whole society.
As the American invasion forces got closer and closer to the homeland, it became an even bigger and more purposeful strategy to not necessarily to win the war, but to make the cost of getting closer and closer to the Japanese homeland so great that they'd be able to achieve a negotiated peace.
For America, the road to Tokyo has been a bloody affair, with thousands of troops killed in the process. The Japanese proved themselves to be warriors, fighting until their last breath, based on a sacred samurai code known as Bushido. Surrender is not an option for its citizens, who are told that they will be shamed forever if they give in to the Americans.
The Army and Marines had certainly encountered this in some of the islands that were taken where Japanese civilians committed suicide rather than be taken prisoner, and they were essentially told and ordered to, oh, you don't know what's going to happen to you, and it's part of this honor not to be taken prisoners. So there had been this sort of preview of the same mentality that American forces had encountered already.
United States generals realized that if the resistance on these islands is this fierce, the invasion of Japan itself could be the mother of all bloodbaths.
The rules of war were that you fought until your last breath, and that was expected of your enemy as well. So the concept of surrendering was something that the Japanese military did not recognize or respect. And it had big consequences on both sides during the conflict, that it was no quarter on both sides.
With the acquisition of island outposts by U.S. forces, landing strips are prepared for the arrival of the massive B-29 superfortress. Being twice the size and having twice the range of the B-17, this gigantic bomber is what America hopes will be the deciding factor in the Pacific, having the capability of flying over Yokohama, Nagoya, and the capital city of Tokyo, allowing for a massive bombardment of the Japanese home islands.
Massed B-29 attacks, hundreds of bombers flying in close formation, dropping incendiaries, were extraordinarily effective in burning Japanese cities. There's no question about that. The attack in Tokyo, again, this is conventional bombs, incendiaries, burned square miles of the city, did huge amount of damage, probably caused 100,000 or so civilian deaths, rivaling what possibly even exceeding what the atomic bombs did.
If the war can be won from the air, hopefully a D-Day style invasion in the Pacific can be avoided. Yet, despite all the deaths and starvation throughout Japan, its military still refuses to acquiesce to the demands of an unconditional surrender. By mid-1944, with American forces ready to take back the Philippines, it becomes clear that the people of Japan will not accept defeat without a fight to the death. Their loyalty is to Emperor Hirohito, and the idea of foreigners occupying the homeland is a concept completely alien to them. They would rather die than surrender to America. It is this belief system that allows the kamikaze fighter to emerge.
A lot of people who've written about the kamikaze suggest that there's some origins in the Shinto religion and the samurai code, and I think that's undeniably true, but it's also stretching it. That there was this, certainly a Japanese martial tradition, there was this notion of personal loyalty to the emperor, and that was clearly driving it. Hirohito himself was very impressed and very supportive of the whole idea of these special attack forces and thought, well, this is the supreme expression of the devotion of the Japanese people to their emperor personally. That's how he viewed it.
In order to protect a perimeter of islands giving America the ability to bomb Japan, squadrons of volunteers begin enlisting for their own version of a divine wind against the United States.
A decision was made, and basically it was during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, that the best chance they had of taking out an American fleet, an American invasion fleet, was to purposely crash their aircraft into these ships.
Unable to sink numerically superior aircraft carriers through traditional methods, they instead must resort to the doctrine of kamikaze.
If this had been the United States and the Japanese were advancing on our homeland, and we had disadvantages in terms of resources, aircraft, and pilots, and wanted to fend off an advancing enemy, certainly, anything becomes possible.
Under the leadership of Admiral Onishi, thousands of men trained for what will be their last mission. A true believer in the Bushido Code, Onishi, with the Emperor's blessing, begins organizing a suicidal war plan. The Ohka, A piloted rocket bomb is authorized along with a human torpedo known as the Kai-10 as weapons to be used against American ships.
There were a small number of special purpose kamikaze aircraft built, the most famous of which was the so-called Cherry Blossom, which was basically a bomb with stubby wings and a cockpit welded on top and a solid rocket motor, and this was dropped from a bomber. The solid rocket motor would be used to accelerate this into a dive approaching 600 miles per hour, so that was particularly difficult to counter when you had such a high terminal speed.
These are in addition to the thousands of kamikaze pilots being trained for their final act in uniform. The goal is simple: fly straight into American ships, and hopefully, with the mixture of fire and gasoline, the explosion causes the vessel to sink.
One pilot and one plane can take out a ship that may have 300 sailors, 500, maybe as many as 3,000 sailors with one well-placed hit. And in a number of occasions they did that or came close to doing it on many others.
And because the decks of American aircraft carriers are made of wood, the probability of a ship going down is even more likely. A key target then for the kamikaze pilots is the central deck elevator, believing that a successful attack can, at the very least, disable the carrier. The advantages of the kamikaze are numerous. Pilots need very little training. Obsolete aircraft can be used, and even if planes are hit by a proximity-fused shell, the momentum can hopefully keep the aircraft on target. The average kamikaze pilot is given a 1-week crash course in suicide attacks. 2 days are spent practicing takeoffs, another 2 to study formation flying, with the last 3 days spent on how to strike a target successfully.
It was a case where some very young pilots were kind of dragooned into doing this. Some older, experienced pilots who were gung-ho were ready to go and do it and maybe had to be restrained, but it went all along the spectrum, I think.
Crash diving, however, is not as simple as it may appear on paper. The powerful lift generated from the high winds makes it difficult to keep the nose of an aircraft on target. Also, there is the strong possibility of pilots blacking out from the heavy gravitational forces when they come crashing down. This entire strategy is a huge gamble, but for the Japanese, with their cities being destroyed, it is their only card left to play. By 1944, as the Americans are set to take back the Philippines in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the first waves of kamikaze attacks are unleashed. Before taking off, Admiral Onishi tells his men as they drink sake, "You are already gods, without earthly desires. Your own crash dive is not in vain. Regrettably, we will not be able to tell you the results, but I shall watch your efforts in the end and report your deeds to the throne." On October 25th, a special attack unit led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki spots an American ship, the St. Lo. Diving straight down, his aircraft hits the ship's deck, exploding like a fireball. Going right through its wooden frame, subsequent explosions begin interacting with torpedoes and bombs on board the vessel, and a new chapter in Second World War history begins.
Then it struck. They call it Kamikaze, meaning the divine tempest. We call them suicide planes, manned by pilots wearing the ceremonial red sash of the Kamikaze Corps. They specialize in one-way trips. Their destination, the deck or hull of any American ship onto which planes, bombs, burning gasoline, and red-sashed pilot crash.
Waves of kamikaze attacks are given the green light by Onishi, with targets not being limited to just strictly naval vessels. With the bombardment of Japanese cities by B-29 superfortresses, orders are given to attack these bombers with the same ferocity. The results prove disappointing. With the B-29's defensive armament that includes remote-controlled gun turrets, kamikaze planes are unable to stop these massive bombers from pulverizing the land of the rising sun.
The Japanese pilots would call them ice castles because they were so far up, and there was no need to camouflage the planes because you weren't. Their elevation was to keep them from having Japanese planes assault them. It was only when tactics changed, when there was a move to more low-level bombing, that the Japanese planes were able to attack them. Even then, there were many instances where the B-29s could actually outrun a Japanese fighter aircraft. It was faster than the aircraft that was trying to pursue them.
And with a scorched earth strategy being carried out, the kamikaze fighter is in a race against the clock. Despite the destruction these tactics are having on American ships, the United States government does not retreat. Their final push to Tokyo will not be derailed, no matter what the cost. So for the next 10 months, American servicemen accept the possibility that today could be their very last.
For the kamikazes, psychologically, I don't think they were prepared at all. It just was such a foreign concept to these young guys, on a ship or in the air, to see somebody who would purposely sacrifice themselves as a way of trying to win a battle. It just was unimaginable to them.
I think that probably the greatest effectiveness of the kamikazes was that it was so incomprehensible to the American military leadership, American society, American understanding. And it did, I mean, don't get me wrong, there was a very real material effect of the kamikaze attacks, but I think the psychological effect really was quite powerful. That it was so hard for American soldiers and sailors and airmen to get their minds around this mentality of people who were willing to do this. And of course, it was very hard to answer. I mean, normally a lot of what air defense and self-defense in general is based on is the idea that this guy is trying to save his life, is trying to avoid being hit, doing something crazy. So it was very hard to answer this.
Hopefully, with the hundreds of guns, rockets, and shells on board destroyers, cruisers, frigates, and battleships, these sailors can shoot down the kamikaze before it is too late. In dealing with this menace, a strategy known as the Big Blue Blanket is employed by naval aviator John Thatch. The plan calls for around-the-clock surveillance by fighter planes over the American fleet, increased attacks on Japanese airfields, and stationing destroyer escorts 50 miles away from the main body to alert the other ships of any approaching Japanese aircraft.
Developing this whole system of radar picket ships that would spot the incoming kamikaze forces, keeping air patrols deployed really around the clock during some of the operations to try to intercept them. So still some did get through. Even in the Battle of Okinawa, it was mainly small ships, American ships, that were sunk. There were no large carriers or battleships that were actually, really put out of action and were sunk by the kamikaze attacks.
This strategy proved successful in disrupting the kamikaze. With Japan in a weakened state, skilled pilots become scarce. As a result, gunmen are finding it easier to shoot down oncoming planes being manned by inexperienced pilots. Despite the toll suicide attacks are taking on soldiers' psyches and lives, most notably on the USS Bunker Hill and the USS Franklin, where hundreds of servicemen are killed, the kamikaze is facing an equally fierce counterstrike.
Ultimately, it was the American military forces were so overwhelmingly powerful, this wasn't going to stop It could cause a lot of casualties, it could inflict a lot of pain along the way, but it wasn't sufficient at any point to even derail American strategic decisions. It caused tactical redeployments, it caused an American diversion of forces to try to deal with the kamikazes, but it couldn't alter American strategy.
The attacks reached their zenith during the battle for Okinawa, where hundreds of suicide planes are used in this pivotal conflict.
They did cause a lot of casualties. The climax was probably the Battle of Okinawa, where close to 2,000 kamikaze attacks took place.
A joint order is written by both the Japanese Army and Navy, establishing suicide as an official policy. This results in 30 American ships sunk and 300 badly damaged in the fight for Okinawa. In the end, the United States takes the island, but only after 12,000 American and 110,000 Japanese deaths. The effect of the kamikaze is being felt in Washington, D.C., where military and civilian planners decide what to do with Japan. Even with the unprecedented bombardment of their cities by B-29s, with the death toll being in the hundreds of thousands, the demand for an unconditional surrender is still not being met. Kamikaze missions, in addition to the fierce resistance offered on Okinawa and Iwo Jima, make generals like George Marshall favor the use of an atomic bomb. The Japanese had demonstrated in each case they would not surrender, said the general. We had to end the war. We had to save American lives. Since President Harry Truman takes office following the death of Franklin Roosevelt, American casualties reached nearly half the total of 3 years of battling against the Japanese in just 3 months.
It was something to contemplate. I remember the terrible anxiety through which the people in Washington went, and I was one of them, wondering what would happen when we attempted to take the main islands of Japan.
Conventional wisdom leads the commander-in-chief to believe that the casualties resulting from a mainland invasion of Japan could be enormous, possibly in excess of 1 million men. For that reason, the decision to drop the first atomic bomb in history is approved by the president. On August 6th, the first nuclear weapon in history is used on the city of Hiroshima, and days later, a second bomb is dropped on the city of Nagasaki. After unprecedented carnage, the demand for an unconditional surrender is finally met. With the defeat of the Japanese comes the defeat of the kamikaze. The impact of these suicide attacks is still hotly debated.
At the time, in 1945, it was seen as a barbarian approach to warfare, an unheard of approach to warfare. 60 years later, you can start to equivocate and say, well, listen, they had to do this. It was in their interest and it was an honorable tactic.
The ships that were sunk as a result of kamikaze planes vary from the mid-30s to the high 50s. Approximately over 4,000 sailors were killed and another 4,000 wounded. However, the entire goal of the kamikaze backfires, causing war planners who may have still been on the fence in terms of whether to drop the atomic bomb or not, to support a nuclear attack on Japan. It was a strategy that grossly underestimated America's resolve in seeking an unconditional surrender from the land of the rising sun. For that reason, no number of suicidal pilots could have stopped the United States' war machine from achieving total victory.
Has there ever been a warplane as mythic as the Mitsubishi Zero? Legend, mystery, and rumor conflated to create an unbeatable fighter flown by samurai-tough pilots. The Zero was said to have an awesome performance, superb maneuverability, and combat characteristics an order of magnitude ahead of anything else in the sky. The oft-forgotten fact is that the Zero's effective combat career was measured in months. The Mitsubishi A6M0 is a long-range carrier-based aircraft fighter formerly manufactured by Mitsubishi Aircraft Company, a part of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and was operated by the Imperial Japanese Navy from 1940 to 1945. The A6M was designated as the Mitsubishi Navy Type 0 carrier fighter, or the Mitsubishi A6M Raisin. The A6M was usually referred to by its pilots as the Raisin, or 0, being the last digit of the imperial year 2600, or 1940, when it entered the service with the Imperial Navy. In the official designation A6M, the A signified a carrier-based fighter, 6 meant that it was the 6th such model built for the Imperial Navy, and M indicated Mitsubishi as the manufacturer. The official Allied report name was Zeke, although the name 0 was used colloquially as well. Not counting its earliest sucker punch missions over China, when the best-trained fighter pilots in the world swatted down scores of ill-flown Polikarpov biplanes and open-cockpit monoplanes. The 0 resigned supreme in the Pacific War, only from the day of the Pearl Harbor attack until American pilots learned the tactics that allowed even pudgy F-4F Wildcats to level the aerial playing field during the Guadalcanal campaign in the summer and fall of 1942. When the second generation of U.S. World War II fighters, the P-38, F-4U, and F-6F arrived beginning in early 1943, the 0 was finished as an effective fighter. In January 1944, a single Marine F-4U pilot, First Lieutenant Robert Hansen, shot down 20 Zeros in just 17 days. The 0 soldiered on until the end of the war, of course, many self-immolating as kamikazes, but only because the Japanese had nothing to replace it, and the 0 often was simply a cannon fodder. The June 1944 Marianas Turkey shoot is the most notorious example of such inequity. Not that the 0 wasn't still dangerous even in the 1945s, especially if an aviator was cocky enough to try to dogfight one of the few remaining experienced 0 pilots. Nobody ever built a fighter that could outmaneuver it, and the fact that Grumman developed the F-8F Bearcat as 0 beater, a task that it was to do just a bit too late to fulfill, shows that the 0 was never entirely disdained. The Japanese had counted on a short, brutal war to force the US to the negotiating table in order to establish unfettered area of Japanese exploitation in South Asia and the Pacific. So Japan had done little to prepare for a protracted conflict. 0 pilots were superbly trained, but only hundreds at a time. Then a few thousand a year while the US was turning tens of thousands of college grads into pilots. The great majority of Japanese pilots were the equivalent of our NCOs. Nor was the production of a 0 successor given high priority. Much like the German High Command initially assumed the Me-109 would suffice for the duration of the war and that it didn't need an engineer or a successor, the Japanese waited too long to develop and produce the Shiden, Raiden, and Reppu, or perhaps they should have developed just one of them. It didn't help that Japan, a small island nation with limited engineering and manufacturing manpower, spent its time dithering over the development of more than 90 major combat types as well as several dozen lesser models. By the time they did get serious, raw materials were lacking and the country's skilled airframe and engine workforce had fled the manufacturing centers due to being bombed out of their homes. The 0 was incrementally improved throughout the war, from the A6M2, the first model to take on American fighters, to the A6M8. Only 2 ever built, intended to attack B-29s. The 0's excellent Nakajima-built Sake engine was eventually upgraded by about 150 horsepower, but it never attained anything like the horsepower offered by the Pratt & Whitney R2800, the P-38's twin Allisons, or the P-51's Packard Merlin. The 0's power-to-weight ratio was always better than that of its US opponents, but sheer horsepower allowed the Americans to loft superior firepower, substantial armor, and overbuilt airframes. What the Japanese needed and never got was not a better 0, but an all-new fighter, a Japanese Hellcat. When the war ended and the 0 stood down, the US was within a week of introducing yet a third generation of Pacific fighters in the form of the Bearcat. The 0 began the Pacific War with an aura of invincibility. At the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, 521 Zeros were active in the Pacific, 328 in first-line units. The carrier-borne Model 21 was the type encountered by the Americans. Its tremendous range over 2,600 kilometers allowed it to range farther from its carrier than expected, appearing over distant battlefronts and giving Allied commanders the impression that there were several times as many Zeros as actually existed. After Pearl Harbor, it quickly became to be viewed as some kind of mystery ship, imbued with strange powers, able to do things that no other airplane could. Yet it was simply a well-engineered, straightforward, optimized aircraft for maneuverability, and flown against an enemy that had never credited the Japanese with the ability to design a cutting-edge fighter. Even though the Claire Chennault of Flying Tigers had been sent back to the US, reports of the airplane's capability over China, they were ignored, and American aircraft recognition manuals didn't even include a picture of the Zero. As aviation historian William Green wrote, the Zero created a myth. The myth of a Japanese invincibility in the air. Its successive appearance over every major battle area in the opening days of the war seemed to indicate that the Japanese possessed unlimited supplies of this remarkable fighter. And its almost mystical powers of maneuver and ability to traverse vast stretches of water fostered the acceptance of a myth of its invincibility in Allied minds. Zeros often showed up so far from the nearest Japanese-controlled land that the Americans set out in search of the carrier from which it was assumed they'd taken off. The Zero was designed by a team under the direction of the brilliant young aeronautical engineer Jiro Horikoshi. Mitsubishi had the foresight to send Horikoshi to work and observe at aircraft factories in Europe and in the US in 1929, and he even spent several months at Curtiss Plant in New York as an acceptance inspector for a batch of P-6 Hawk pursuit biplanes the Japanese had ordered. Horikoshi had already engineered the Mitsubishi A5M, later codenamed the Claude by the Allies. For an open cockpit, fixed-gear fighter, the A5M displayed outstanding performance, in no small part because of its flush riveting, a production technique that the Japanese would subsequently use on the Zero at a time when American airframers were just discovering its low-drag advantage. In order to fight not only the already overmatched Chinese, but also the Pacific War against the US that was beginning to look inevitable, however, Japan still needed something more than just the Claude. The Japanese would never have attacked Pearl Harbor if they didn't have the Zero. At the time, in fact, some planners had misgivings that there weren't yet enough Zeros available for the attack to succeed. When the Japanese Navy gave Mitsubishi its marching orders as the Zero design began, it demanded a triple threat: an escort with the extreme range that needed to accompany bombers deep into China and later to cover over vast Pacific distances, a point defense interceptor with a rapid rate of climb to hit attacking bombers before they reached their targets, and a consummate dogfighter with extreme maneuverability. Though it's often assumed that the Japanese Army Air Force also flew Zeros, it never did. Another Zero oddity is that though all Japanese naval aviators were carrier qualified, many, including the famous Zero super ace Saburo Sakai, never operated from a carrier in combat. The extreme range criterion resulted in one piece of a little acknowledged pioneering for which the Zero was responsible. It was the first airplane designed from inception to carry an ejectable external fuel tank. A Zero's maximum fuel load, including the belly tank, typically was about 230 gallons. And this gave it 7 or 8 hours of combat endurance. Sakai set the Zero endurance record, just over 12 hours, by throttling back to 1,700 RPM and running what today we'd call lean of peak, maximum height exhaust gas temperature, at just 130 miles an hour. He intentionally ran his tanks bone dry while circling above Formosa Air Base after a mission and dead-sticked in from 8,000 feet. Another Zero innovation was its 360-degree view cockpit canopy, second only to the British Westland Whirlwind's bubble canopy. Though it was a multi-pane greenhouse rather than a true bubble, the Zero's glassware provided a considerably better rearward view than anything but a true open cockpit design, and had also excellent drag-reducing properties. It could also be opened in flight but not jettisoned, making parachute egress difficult. It was assumed that a Zero samurai would continue fighting to their death rather than bail out. Most Zero pilots refueled to wear parachutes in any case, until they ultimately were ordered to strap them on. In the late 1930s, the Japanese had developed nothing more powerful than several 800 to 1000 HP radials with little grown potential. At a time when American, British, and German manufacturers were cranking out 1,200 horsepower engines with 2,000 horsepower visible on the horizon. So Horikoshi needed to make his new fighter super light, which he did in part by having lightened holes cut and drilled through every internal airframe part possible, a technique that race car builders would recognize immediately. Horikoshi also persuaded the Navy to change its ultimate load standards for many components he didn't consider crucial. He designed them to fail, but then rebound them to previous shape as soon as they were reduced. As a result, the Zero was the fastest 1,000 HP radial engine fighter ever produced, but one with a number of single-point failure locations that, if hit, could bring down the airplane. The Zero was skinned with the lightest gauge aluminum possible, and when the shadows were right, some photos of the Zeros in flight show them seemingly clothed in crinkled tinfoil. British test pilot Eric Brown, who flew a captured Zero immediately after the war, even today recalls the constant noise of the oil canning fuselage skin, like the sound produced when one pushes on the side of a large biscuit tin. A typical Zero, loaded with full fuel and ordnance, weighed about 5,500 pounds, less than a mid-sized Cessna twin. A fully loaded Hellcat weighed over twice as much. The single heaviest component of any airframe is the main wing spar. Horikoshi lightened the Zeros by 30% by using a new zinc aluminum alloy called Super Ultra Duraluminum, which had recently been developed by Sumitomo Metals. One major benefit of the 7075 over the Sumitomo metal was that it was very corrosion resistant. In another weight-saving measure, the Zero's main spar was continuous, from wingtip to wingtip, and thus was an inseparable part of the fuselage center section rather than having a left and right wing, each bolted to the fuselage. This eliminated the weight of fasteners and spar buckets. Though it might seem that permanently affixed wings could make a Zero difficult to transport, Horikoshi had designed the entire tail cone and empennage to easily unbolt just aft of the cockpit. With everything removed forward of the firewall as well, the wing and cockpit became a single long but light narrow truckload. Horikoshi's search for lightness led him to the oft-criticized failure to include adequate armor or self-sealing fuel tanks in the Zero design. What was forgotten, however, is that virtually no fighters at the time the Zero was introduced had such features. It remained for the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940 to demonstrate the need for armor and protected tanks. In any case, the Zero's designers considered armor unnecessary because they didn't think anybody would be able to put any rounds into the fighter. Maybe a lucky shot here and there, but not enough of a danger to compromise the design's lightness. Little did they know what the Navy and Marines had in store for them. Most combat units also removed their Zero's radios for additional weight savings, since the Japanese transceiver was very poor quality. This left the Zero pilots unable to warn wingmen of surprise attacks, and they could coordinate their own attacks only with occasional hand signals. A typical multi-plane Zero attack was a melee of individual aerobatics, and Japanese pilots were in nearly as much danger of mid-airs with their mates as they were of getting shot at. As one of the USN pilots put it, from the way Zero pilots rollicked around in the sky, at times, it looked as they would rather stunt than fly. Yokonawa flew upside down, having both hands around the cockpit, wrote Sakai in his book Samurai. Then, he flew directly over me, under me, and went through a wide hesitation roll around my fighter. He was like a kid showing off. He finally flew on my wing and held the stick between his knees. Still grinning, he waved his lunchbox at me and started to eat. The Zero's flight controls mixed some ingenious engineering with at least one awkward feature. Its ailerons were large and powerful, which added greatly to the fighter's low-speed maneuverability and spectacular roll rate, but they were very difficult to deflect at high speeds. American pilots soon learned to dive and turn sharply, especially to the right, which substantial prop-induced torque made particularly difficult for the Zero when they had a Zero on their tail. Horikoshi did an interesting job with the Zero's elevator, however. The airplane's speed range was broad, from low-speed maneuvering to flat-out dashes at more than 300 miles an hour, and elevator effectiveness, of course, increased with speed, to the point where it could become quite touchy. So Horikoshi designed an elastic control system, with thin elevator cables that stretched a bit as speed increased and slightly flexible elevator control torque tube. Normally, such a setup would be an anathema to an aeronautical engineer, for it encouraged an elevator to flutter as speeds increased. But somehow, whether through luck or engineering talent, Horikoshi found a sweet spot where there was no danger of flutter, yet elevator control forces remained constant regardless of the airspeed. Zeros were feared in part because of the two heavy wing-mounted 20mm cannons, Swiss Oerlikons built under license by the Japanese. Horikoshi suspected that the Zero would yaw appreciably as first one and then the other cannon fired and recoiled, so he specified for a fuselage longer than its optimal length, which gave the vertical stabilizer a longer moment arm and thus provided greater longitudinal stability. But the Oerlikons were still problematic. They had a low rate of fire, limited capacity, initially only 60 rounds per gun, later increased to 100, and low muzzle velocity. The latter meant that the cannon was effective for close-in fighting, where a single round into a Wildcat's wing, root, or cockpit could mean a kill. But as the distance to a target increased, the cannon's rounds would lose energy and drop away ineffectually, like a softball thrown underhand. A number of the Zero's smaller components, such as instruments and engine accessories, were also license-built Bendix, Sperry, Colesman, and other designs, which could lead to later claims that the airplane was a copy of the Hughes H-1 Racer or the vaguely similar-looking Vought V143. But as Horikoshi later wrote, we were trying to surpass the rest of the world's technology, not just catch up to it. The Zero's single most important US part was its Hamilton standard design constant speed propeller. The Japanese had also bought a V143 in 1937, and the Zero's landing gear and retraction mechanism was almost certainly a copy of the Vought's design. After all, the Zero was one of the first retractables the Japanese built. The Zero's 2 cowl-mounted machine guns were not particularly effective, especially against the new generation of heavies overbuilt the US fighters. At little more than a half of the caliber of the American 50 cals, they were used by many Zero pilots mainly as pointers for their cannons. If they saw hits from the machine guns, they toggled the cannons alive and fired them instead. Just like a World War I Spot or Fokker, the Zero's receivers were in the cockpit, above the instrument panel on either side, and the pilot pulled levers to charge them. Ultimately, the Zero's main failing was that it was designed to a 1930s paradigm. Air combat meant dogfighting, and dogfighting, at least in the days before energy management, meant to circle chase in one form or another, with the better airplane turning tighter than the lesser one and eventually getting into a firing position from a rear quarter. Victory was then nearly inevitable. And the Zero was the world's tightest turning, most maneuverable fighter. Thanks to its aerobatic ability, Zero pilots also developed a combat maneuver that initially baffled American airmen, a kind of sideways loop with square turns and side slips out of the turns, which tightened their turn greatly. It didn't take long, however, for American pilots to learn that the rat racing with the Zero was a loser's game, so they disbanded tail chases that played straight into the Zero's only air combat strength. It was neither strong, unusually fast, good in a dive, nor effectively armed. Hit and run became the mantra. Attack a Zero from above, fire while diving upon it, and keep going. Convert diving energy into zooming altitude and do it again if necessary. Perhaps it was inevitable that the Zero would become a myth, a legend, a paragon amongst fighters, when it was in fact a conventional plane with several ahead of its time characteristics. It could be argued that the Zero was an excellent airplane, but a lousy fighter. If you discount the victories over poorly trained Chinese pilots flying outmoded Soviet fighters, the huge fleet of Allied aircraft destroyed while they were parked in the opening days of the war, and the kills of utterly unprepared American pilots in many cases flying adequate airplanes but using the wrong tactics against the Zero, the mythical Mitsubishi comes off surprisingly poorly. It was extremely light and had numerous failure points, where very few rounds of heavy caliber machine gun fire could do catastrophic damage. It was flammable, and its pilots were terribly vulnerable. It was not particularly fast, and in any case, its high-speed handling was poor. Its controls were poorly harmonized. Its armament was a mixed bag of 2 light machine guns and crude cannons. It had no useful communications equipment. Ultimately, the Zero was a bare-bones airplane. Nothing extra, nothing fancy. With very little margin for modification, designs which had little, if any, stretch built into them, wrote Zero expert Robert Mikesh. Some say that because the Zero was the best dogfighter in the Pacific theater, perhaps the world, it was by definition the best fighter. But there's also an old saying, to win, you have to finish. Unfortunately for the Japanese, the Pacific War was one race that the Zero finished last. Dead last.
OK かなこれで。じゃあ用意スタート。
一番の特徴はですね、私に言わせますならば航続力ですね。
長い。
非常に長時間飛べるということです。どんな素晴らしい格闘性能を持っていても、 時間がなくてはですね、いい試案を浮かばないですよ。だから私はもう航続力だと思うんです。第2番目が堀越先生、苦心の作であるところのこのエレベーター昇降だですね、この機首を上げ下げするこの舵の効き具合が操縦桿の引き具合とこのエレベーターの効き具合が低速でも高速でも操縦するパイロットの考えてる通り動いてくれるように設計されてる。これがこの格闘性の特に縦の運動ですね、この宙返りを利用した縦の運動、これが非常に優れてたということです。ですからもちろん真後ろについた場合はですね、どんなに彼らが逃げ回っても絶対我々がこの真後ろへピャッとつけたらですね、だいたい35、6メーターか40メーター、どんな逃げ方してもプロレスで言えばキーロックですね。ガチッとはめたらもう仕留めます。
もう逃げられない。
よっぽどのことじゃなければ。ただこういう具合にめったになりませんけど、なった時でもこの縦の運動に引っ込めば、だいたい3000点から4000点すれば挽回すると。そのくらいにゼロ戦の特徴というものはこの縦の運動のエレベーターを利用したところの、私なんかは斜め宙返りを利用したひねり込みと言ってましたけど、このひねり込みが古いパイロットには一人味のあるですね、自分流の、技をですね、いつの間にか開発していきました。その当時ですね、本当に私たちがラボル国体で油の乗り切ってる頃、ちょうどこのスピンナーの先、この先端ですね、これはこういう感じてましたよ。
一体
それから
ね、じゃあ
この先翼端がですね、この中指に感じてましたね。そのくらいに完全に飛行機マスターしてましたから、もう地上で自分の体を動かすよりも空中で、ゼロ戦操縦してバーッと向ける方が速くて確実に行くぐらいに完全に飛行機そのものが自分になってました。戦闘機というのはですね、その周り360度全部敵ですから、むしろこう敵を探すとか見張る場合には、私なんかもう前を2後ろを9と、
前を2後ろを9、なるほど。
翼の裏と胴体のここが一番怖いんです。見えないところですから、どっから来るか分かりませんが、年中こう腰をひねってですね、飛行機をひっくり返しながら、自分の後ろが大丈夫かってことを見て、前はパッと見れば分かりますから、もうすぐ気になりますから、これを気にならない人はやられるんです。私たち考えてましたのは、非常に重量を軽く作ってありますから、非常に機体全般が弱かったですね。そうですからアメリカの飛行機には絶対そんなことないんですけども、もうこのゼロ戦には制限スピードというのがありまして、それを出すとバリッといくのが危ないんですね。いつも危険を感じてました。それから第2番目が、弾を食らった場合に、全く覚えようがないということです。最後のこれはパイロットあたりちょっとカバーしたり、タンクをちょっとやったりしましたけども、全般的に見てほとんど無防御という形ですから、やられたらもうライターのように火がつくと、そういう弱点があったですね。こちらから攻めていく場合、何百マイル飛んでいく場合には、もうどういうものか、日本軍はその生きて旅衆の恥ずかしみを受けるという、その絶対に捕虜にならないという考えでしたから、それ強制されたもんじゃなかったんですけども、攻めていく場合には落下傘持ってきませんでしたね。落下傘はもちろん座布団、クッション代わりに持っていきますけども、バンドをもう置いていっちゃうんです。だから落下傘持っていかないと同じで、敵視上でやられたらもう自爆する以外ないと。今考えればもったいないことで、それで随分死んでるんですけどもね。右の目はほとんど見えなくなってますし、左の目もやられてもうほとんど失明状態で、コンパスが全然見えないんですよね。ちょうどここへ、一発はこういう弾が当たってますね。そしてこれへ抜けたんですね。
これに抜けてるわけですか。
でその時の傷がこの傷ですけどもね。それから一発はこっちから入って、でこれをかすったんですね。
なるほど。
だから ほとんど失神状態で頭やられたってことも後で分かったんですけどもね。それからその時血を止めたのが最後のマフラーこれ残りまして、これで、血を止めたんですよ。この、地図のようにですね、航路がめちゃくちゃでしょ。島も何にもないとこ行ってしまって、このまま行ったらハワイ行ってしまうと思ったんです。ラボールはこの辺にあるような感じがするんですよ。自分の飛行の癖と飛行機の癖を見ましてね。それで見えた瞬間に起点が取れませんから、地球上のどこにいるかわからないですから、コンパス見えても、それどうもこの辺にあると思ったけどもね、ここまで来て30度や40度ケチケチするなと思ってですね、男らしく直角に曲がれと思って直角に曲がったわけですよ。それがドンピシャリ当たったわけです。こういうような、15ラウンド戦ったボクサーの姿みたいですよね。顔の格好も歪んでしまって。
Let's take the case of one pilot. His name was Jimmy Saunders. His story starts on the day when he was flying to a base somewhere in the Far East. Come in.
Lieutenant Saunders reporting for duty, sir.
Glad to have you with us, Lieutenant.
Glad to be here, Major.
We can certainly use you. Sit down. Cigarette?
Oh, thank you, sir.
How was the flight over?
Well, I made it, sir, with the help of a P-40.
You like our P-40s?
Oh, yes, sir. It's a nice airplane.
Good. Then maybe we can count on you not to shoot any of them down.
Oh, I didn't have any plans along that line, sir.
It's been done, you know.
You mean jet pilots?
I mean American pilots. Men with as much enthusiasm for the P-40 as you have, but with an unfortunate lack of ability to tell a friend from an enemy.
Excuse me, sir, but how could anybody mistake a P-40 for a Zero?
A great many things can happen in the excitement of preparing for combat. Too many pilots are too anxious to make sure they're killed. They start shooting before they've made certain what they're shooting at. It's a damn sight better to let a Zero get away than to knock down one of your own planes. Say nothing of one of your own men. We've few enough to spare around here.
Sir, I had no idea.
We're not broadcasting, in fact.
I know, but...
Now, don't misunderstand me, Lieutenant. It's not a common occurrence. Most of our men know their planes. Identification becomes second nature to them. If there's still a doubt in their minds, they maneuver close enough to make sure. Of course, there is such a thing as being too cautious. Take the case of the man who drew those silhouettes.
Say, that's quite a job.
He had plenty of time for it. Been flat on his back for 2 months. Shot down while he was still maneuvering around trying to decide if the other plane was a Zero or not. He found out. If he'd known his identification, that Zero might never have gotten him. Well, he learned his lesson, and to make certain that others would profit by it, he put it all down in those. All right, let's see if you can do your wafting on the Zero.
Yes, sir. With or without looking?
You might as well make it easy on yourself now. It'll be a lot tougher upstairs.
Yes, sir. Wings. Leading edge tapers, trailing edge tapers, tips rounded, slight dihedral angle.
You might add to that that there are two 20-millimeter cannons mounted one in each wing, probably Swiss Oerlikon guns.
Yes, sir. Here's something I didn't know about, sir.
Huh? Oh, yes. The wingtips can be folded so as to utilize more space in a carrier. Incidentally, the span is 39 feet 4 inches. All right, go on with the engine.
Engine, radial, Mitsubishi version of our Cyclone.
That's right. There are twin-row 14 cylinders. Now for the fuselage.
Fuselage. Blunt nose with a spinner on it. Cockpit canopy sits on the fuselage. Retractable landing gear with fairing plates. Say, there seems to be one gear missing, sir.
The gears are operated hydraulically. As a result, the wheels retract alternately.
I guess there are a couple of things I don't know about this airplane, sir.
I'm glad to hear you admit it. That's the beginning of wisdom. The wings and the fuselage are in one piece, made of duraluminum. There's another feature worth noting. The entire fuselage is flush riveted. With the result, there are very few protuberances to cause wind resistance. The length is 28 feet 5 inches. There's a pair of machine guns mounted in grooves above the cowling. They're 7.7 millimeter, and they're synchronized to fire through the propeller. I hope you don't ever get them on your tail. I'm with you there, sir. All right, finish her up.
Tail. Leading edge of flat surface tapers more than trailing edge, with the fuselage extending to a point beyond it. Leading edge of vertical piece tapers more than trailing edge. Tail is pointed, curves out away from the nose. I guess that's it, sir.
Good enough. As you probably know, there are 3 types of Zeros. One is a single float plane without rig. All 3 have slightly varying characteristics. But this is the type you're most apt to tangle with, so get to know her. All of her.
Yes, sir. I'll look for the balls of rouge on her wings and fuselage.
And I wouldn't depend on that if I were you. The Japs have a neat trick of painting her all sorts of colors. Sometimes even like our P-40s. Coffee?
No, thanks. Well, sir, how soon do I get a chance to knock one up and down?
Soon enough. But don't get any idea that the Zero's a pushover. With 340 miles an hour top speed, a service ceiling of 35,500 feet, and a normal range of 700 miles, increased by a droppable extra fuel tank, there's not much she can't do. They built her light and maneuverable, threw away the armor protection for the pilot and the self-sealing gasoline tanks. She only weighs around 5,200 pounds, fully loaded, and has a horsepower of over 900. And when you see the speed with which she climbs, you'll appreciate what I'm saying. There's just no use trying to dogfight a Zero. That's out. Your best bet is to hit fast, either the wings or just behind the cockpit. But if you miss, don't hang around.
Really as bad as all that, sir?
Seeing's believing. If I were you, I'd take my word for it.
Yes, sir.
Now, here's our operations. When you're on your own, you'll do patrol from our base here to these outlying islands.
Well, the big day finally came. Saunders was on his own, out Jap hunting. Looked sort of keyed up. Wouldn't you be? Don't expect too much, Lieutenant. Not on your first day. What's up? See something? It's a plane, all right. But what sort of a plane? Friend or enemy? P-40 or Zero? Well, now's the time to remember your recognition. Now, has it a deep radiator? Round tail curving in toward nose? Inline engine? Then it's a P-40. Or has that plane an oil cooler and air scoop? Pointed tail curving out away from nose? Radial engine? If it has, then it's a Zero. Tough to tell from here. Maybe if you got closer. Start climbing, Saunders. Take another look. Hold it, Saunders. Make sure. Zero, that's a P-40. A lucky thing you missed. You want that on your conscience. Look, it's coming back. Like to take another shot at it? Okay, we will rub it in. Oh, you've got it coming to you, not waiting to get your recognition.
Wish I could apologize from here.
Well, what's stopping you? Go on over there.
Are you sure it's P-40? I'm positive, sir. After he held fire, he drew up and dipped his wings in recognition. I don't like to complain, sir, but do we have to fight our own Air Force too? You've got good cause to complain. I don't know who's responsible for this, but when I do, come in.
Major, I want you... I'm sorry, sir. Lieutenant Saunders reporting, sir.
Yes, Lieutenant? Weldon here has been telling me that he was attacked this afternoon by one of our planes. Do you by any chance know anything about this?
Yes, sir. I'm afraid it was me.
He's afraid.
Well, Saunders, what have you got to say for yourself?
Not much, sir. For distance, I was sure it was a zero, and I held my fire.
A little late on your identification, weren't you?
Yes, sir. But I did run.
How far were you from the other plane when you opened fire?
I'm not quite sure, sir.
We'll soon find out. Have your film developed immediately.
Yes, sir.
Major, I want... It can wait, Lieutenant. Get after that film.
Yes, sir.
Corporal, get the projector ready.
Yes, sir.
How could you start firing at that distance? Hold it. Didn't you look in your sight?
I thought I did, sir.
You don't seem to be very sure of yourself, Lieutenant.
I'm sure of one thing, Major.
After I look at that airplane. It's closer now, I realize, but even at the distance you started firing, you should have been able to identify it. Look at that deep radiator, the inline engine. That cockpit canopy fits into the fuselage. The tail is round and curves in toward the nose. All right, Corporal, take it away.
There's more film, sir.
I'm sorry, Lieutenant, but I have an appointment. You can stay and run it if you want to. Coming, Weldon.
If you don't mind, sir, I think I'll stay for a few more feet. I want to see how close I came to being wiped out.
Carry on, Corporal.
Now I know what a clay pigeon feels like. Hey, wait a minute. That's not me. It's a zero.
What? Hold it. Well, Saunders, I think I'll forego that appointment. Let's hear about this.
Well, sir, following my encounter with the lieutenant here, I was flying along, wondering if I should slit my throat. I felt like a candidate for the Jap Air Force. It was getting time to turn for home. Not that I was homesick. I had a hunch what was in store for me. Well, there was no use stalling. I was thinking, that other guy's probably back already, telling the Major how he almost got knocked down by another P-40. I was thinking what you'd tell me when I got back. Suddenly, I stopped thinking. I saw something. Another plane. I tried to make her out. She was too far away. I started to climb. I had to get my recognition right this time.
Cigar-shaped fuselage tapering to point and rear.
Check.
Wings close to nose. Canopy sits on fuselage.
Check.
Tail pointed. Curving out. Blunt nose. Stubby spinner.
Radial engine. Oil cooler. Air scoop at bottom of nose. It's a zero. Check. I thought I had it, but I missed. I lit for home. Hell bent for home. But I had company. Right on my table. Mistake that baby made. Suddenly he was right in my sight. It was a hell of an explosion and... well, I guess that's all, sir.
That's enough. Oh. What's the matter with you, Weldon?
Well, it just occurred to me, sir. There, but by the grace of God, went on.
I see your point. I don't think, however, that you'll have anything to worry about in the future. At least not from Saunders. He seems to have learned his lesson. By a method I'd hardly recommend putting into general practice, but nevertheless he's learned it thoroughly. If every pilot would only realize the importance of identification and become letter perfect in the art of identification, fewer lives lost and fewer planes destroyed. Know your enemy, but also know your friend.